Welcome to Bill for coming, and thank you very much. And we'll definitely have time for questions at the end. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I am very, very excited to be here. So as you are about to hear, this very simple talk was a project that took up about a decade of my life. And I'm very keen to share this with you because it's become clear that you all are actually very interested in digging deeper and considering what this might look like if you were to actually make it happen. The difference between like an opinion and execution. And that is what this is all about, which is what our experience was when we tried to say, can you do that? So I'm very excited to have a chance to share it with people that are actually interested in the topic. So what I'd like to do over the next 45 minutes or so is cover about 6 categories. First, I'd like to start by highlighting the need for change in from the US, so from the US healthcare industry, but I also brought data to show you how you compare to us. And I'll give you a hint, everyone's better than we are. But I will show you how much better. So what's become clear overall is that the rising costs of healthcare in most countries is actually unsustainable. And the value that we get for the enormous amount of money that we put toward it is actually very poor. So we'll then move on and dig into some of the major trends and barriers to what it looks like when you try to integrate clinical care and research. And then I'd like to move on and suggest to you a paradigm shift in the way we think about learning health systems. And then I'm going to drill down deeper and describe what we call the LFEP, Learn from Every Patient program model and structure that we came up with to try to say, could you do that? And then I will move on and I will share actually the experience that we had, good and bad, when we actually tried to implement a pilot program in a functioning academic medical center. And in the spirit of your Learning Health Systems series, I'll finish by sharing with you what we think were our major learning points, so that hopefully that will be of some use to you all. Okay, so this is a very busy slide, and it's not my intent to go through it in detail, but several years ago, there was a landmark article that compared healthcare spending across 11 of the wealthiest countries on our planet using recognized international data. And all you really need to know here, this pointer work? Yes. So every country, the 11 countries are all the same color in both of these slides. So every country has a color and got ranked 1 to 11. My country's yellow, your country's orange. So this is a slide looking at healthcare spending per capita across the 11 of the wealthiest countries in the world. The next one will show healthcare outcomes that they got for all of that spending. And look right there, there we are. So the US has the highest percentage of their gross domestic product of any country that we spend on healthcare. Actually, since this is published, it's now over 18.5% of our gross domestic product goes to healthcare. That's a big industry. Actually, that's a very big industry to run poorly, but it is true for us. And our mean spending there, I don't know if you can read it, the 9,400, that is approximately twice per capita what the average is of the other 10 highest income countries in the world. So we clearly spend the most. And here you are. So you all do much better on your spending per capita for healthcare than we do. You're ranked 9 and 10 on spending out of 11. So let's look at what you get for what you spend. This is an identical slide looking at healthcare outcomes. All the countries are ranked again 1 to 11. All the countries are the same color. I'm yellow, you're orange. So with regard to outcomes, look at my country. Here we are, life expectancy, ranked number 11. So that's correct. So we spend twice as much as the average of the other wealthiest countries in the world. And for outspending everyone, we rank dead last. Something's wrong. So if you look down below also, there are some other accepted international metrics for outcomes in countries. And the maternal mortality, oh, we're number 1 in that. Infant mortality, we're #1 in that. So for most of the major ways that we measure what you get for what you spend, our country is like on fire, needing to do something different to try to decide how to spend our 18.5% of our gross domestic product. So you all are somewhere in between for most of these metrics, but I will point out that for infant mortality, you're barely better than we are. So this is a very high level, but it's pretty revealing data about what societies do to provide for their citizens. For me, this is the unmet need. This is the burning platform that suggests we really, really need to do something different, and we probably need to think differently if we're going to do something different. So over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a convergence of several trends in medicine. One of them is the conversion to electronic medical records. Not sure about your country. In our country, it was mandated. So people did what they needed to do, what was required. There's also been prioritization of clinical and translational research. The US spends about $500 million a year on CTSA grants, clinical and translational science awards, to provide infrastructure for clinical and translational research. And last, but definitely not least, the point that I just made, there's been a significantly increasing need to come up with some way to control healthcare expenditures. So all of this stirring up has led to unprecedented levels of interest and some very interesting opportunities to develop some systems that might actually be able to improve care and reduce costs at the same time, not one for the other. So the other interesting thing is that a learning healthcare system has been specifically called for by our US National Academy of Medicine. That was back in 2012 that they first called for that. Very interesting to me also is that the Hastings, oh, I'm sorry, you can't see it either. The Hastings Center is a nonprofit bioethics think tank, and they came up with a very different rationale for this. They presented that integration of research into clinical care is actually a moral obligation that we have, that we actually should be using the information that we collect when we provide the care to improve their care. Okay, so that whatever I did, where's William when I need him? Hang on. Oh, yes. Okay. So why, if this is so much money and if there's such a need to do it, how come it's not done already? Well, it turns out there are significant barriers here, and some of these may resonate with you all since you have endeavored to go down this path. But I'll just highlight some of the high-level categories. Inadequate organizational readiness. The obvious one is that it may be infrastructure related, but there also are oftentimes financial and political reasons that organizations are simply unready to make the changes necessary to achieve these goals. Inadequate information standards with different terminologies, different data models, different data architectures is a big problem, particularly if there's more than one hospital. So I work in a freestanding children's hospital. So it is one nonprofit, but it has a hospital side and a research institute side. And when I moved there, they didn't even have the same software. So I was an employee on both sides, but I had to bring my little thumb drive, and because the software didn't connect. Same employer. So inadequate technology integration with differing IT systems is another significant barrier, although I will submit to you that I think that is largely falling by the wayside. But the last one is super important. Inadequate workflow integration. So how many of you provide clinical care and have done research? All right, so if you have done that, you know that this last statement is true. There are profoundly different processes and cultures around how we provide care for patients. And then even though you're the same person, how you do research on them. Different rules, different approvals, different regulations, different personnel. It is significantly different. And we will come back to this as we move forward, because this, I think, turns out to be one of the biggest challenges. So I just tried to summarize. So all of those barriers aren't because somebody's trying to get in the way, but when we took a deep dive and said, who actually has skin in this game? If we're going to imagine a learning health system. So we were able to list out 16 different stakeholders, from the C-suite to the chief research information officer, the chief medical information officer, the risk management team, the doctors and the nurses. There are a lot of different stakeholders that go into a large medical center doing what we call providing care. And I'm not going to go through the primary interests on the right. My goal is to show you that all those people go to work and their boss is expecting them to do something different. That's not a problem. That's just where we are. These people are getting paid to do the things on the right, and that is what they are going to do first. And what I tried to do for purposes of this discussion is to show a cartoon of what that might look like. And that cartoon shows our current state with this paradigm where these are all the same people on the previous slide, and they are all connected. They all work at the same place. They have the same ID badge, but they don't actually all work together for one goal. They work for their goals that they're hired to do. And what that leads to is down here on the bottom left: inconsistent care, rising costs, variable quality, and overall poor value, as I showed you with data in those original slides. So what I'd like to suggest over the next 30 minutes or so is a paradigm shift. What if we imagined a future state here, what I would call a learning health system paradigm, where we have all these different stakeholders, but they all realize that the job that they do in that organization is in the service of something larger, the service of something that leads us to have interests that are aligned and that will ultimately result in better care at lower costs with improved quality, which is by definition what we call value. And all of those barriers that I talked about, these are what we've tried to show graphically here as headwinds. These are the headwinds that keep pushing us to the left. Everybody wants to do it. Everybody talks about it. Every medical center I know has this in their strategic plan. So there is no one that is not trying to do this, but the headwinds are significant. So what we decided was we needed to come up with some sort of disruptive innovation to try to overcome those headwinds. And what you can see here is inside this circle is where we ended up. What if you imagined a state where we said we're going to provide evidence-based medicine, shown here on the left, and we're going to fully integrate it with evidence-generating medicine on the right? Not as separate events, as the same activity. What if we imagine doing that together? And so for us, what we decided is we were going to try an experiment, which is in the center of this little storm, LFEP, our Learn from Every Patient program. What would it look like if we actually did research on every patient every day? And what if people actually were interested and prepared to analyze the data to use it to improve care? So this model actually is very different than many of the other models that you may have heard about for learning health systems. Historically, a lot of people have talked about learning health systems as aggregating large data sets from multiple hospitals in a system or across multiple systems. PedsNet connects the 8 largest children's hospitals, or now 11 largest children's hospitals in the US. And they put all the data together and they set out trying to figure out what we can learn from all that data. There must be things we can learn. This is what I would consider to be the antithesis. This is taking a single clinical program, committing to learn from every patient in that program, and that's shown graphically here, and then that program sharing in the context of that medical center with other clinical programs. How'd you do that? How'd you get done all those things? How'd you get past all those stakeholders to agree and let you do it? So it could move from clinical program to clinical program within a learning health organization, this larger circle, and ultimately between learning health organizations that all have clinical programs. We all have very similar clinical programs across all of our institutions. We do not share generally what we've learned or how we've learned it or how we've overcome the barriers to do it. But in our vision, this is the way, a way to build a learning health system from the bottom up. And so we will spend the rest of our time talking about what it looks like if you try to do one dot at one place. So we generated a hypothesis. So we hypothesized that a learning health system could be cost effectively developed and implemented to systematically drive both clinical quality improvement and reduced healthcare costs. And to test our hypothesis, we said, okay, we're going to develop and implement a pilot program based on complete integration of research and clinical care. And so I have, truth be told, I think Rulan may know this, I have an engineering background. I thought, oh, okay, it's a little systems engineering thing. We're going to just dial it in. Okay, so the vision here was that we would fully integrate the knowledge that we gain from direct clinical care with research to systematically, not as an add-on, but systematically advance the care of those children. And the way that we retermed it for other stakeholders in our institution is that we would learn from every patient at every visit and use that knowledge to improve the care of the children that followed that child. And you can tell me at the end of the presentation whether you think that we actually tried to do that or not. So this is perhaps the most important slide in this entire presentation. So this is the LFEP program model, and this warrants just a little, let me just take you through this because we were talking about the model and how that may be different from quality improvement models and things like that. So this model starts on the left where patients all receive evidence-based standardized care. Actually, that's not even true today for most clinical programs. So even getting on this map is not straightforward. But the idea was you start with everyone getting evidence-based care, and then you collect clinical and research data during those clinical visits as a result of the provision of the care, and you migrate that data to a data mart. So the same data mart where you could put digital radiology images, pharmacy prescription data, proteomic data, transcriptomic data, metabolomic data, all of the data that is able to be identifiable back to the patient that you gave the care to would be located and accessible in this data mart. And then when data from those clinical and research sources get systematically analyzed, we all recognize that. That's really what we recognize as translational research. And so what do we do with translational research at academic medical centers? We publish it. And that's shown down here, peer-reviewed publication. So part of what people like me and Rulan get paid to do is do research and publish it. In fact, our careers are measured by that. Our promotions are dependent upon it. This is what we are supposed to do. And this is oftentimes where this circle stops. Oh, done. I need another project and another grant. In this vision, however, what we imagined is that this new knowledge would actually drive incremental improvements in both cost effectiveness and standards of care to lead to what we recognize as quality improvement. Everyone I know has a quality improvement program, a quality improvement team, a quality improvement budget. But it's this last part which is largely not done effectively, which is to systematically apply those improvements to the care of every patient in your institution. So this is what we would recognize as implementation science. Most academic medical centers are not very good at implementation science. So the idea here is that if you make one spin around this loop, if you brought your child to see us at Nationwide Children's Hospital and they got evidence plus expert opinion-based care, and you came back for a follow-up visit, let's say in 2 years, your child would still get completely evidence-based care, but the evidence would be different and the care would be different. And if you were interested in knowing why it's different, we could show you the publications. It's not anecdotal evidence, it is peer-reviewed evidence. So this is the difference between what we have now, where it's estimated that 3% of adults that get medical care are involved in clinical trials, and probably only 1 or 2% of children that get medical care are included in clinical trials. This is the difference between 3% of people who contribute to the future of care and 100%. So it is a conceptually different idea. So at this point, I thought this was pretty cool. Like, okay, systems engineering, ready, set, go. Time for a little perspective here. So inspiration like that is easy. Implementation is almost always the hard part. So since I was new there and they hired me to do this, I'm like, okay, let's get together. So let's build the team. So I had to go hunting for a clinical program to be that one dot. Some doctor that was in charge of a clinical program that was willing to do things differently if I guaranteed her that she would move from having all of her doctors provide what they thought was best in clinic to evidence-based care. And I showed her a way that she could know that the care for her patients were improved. Actually, that was what she got hired to do, and I heard about it. So I knew she would be susceptible to, to my idea. So this turned out to be a cerebral palsy clinic. So then I went about trying to find who the key stakeholders were: doctors, nurses, clinical staff, admins, our electronic health record team, which is EPIC, Enterprise Data Warehouse, that's the data mart, research informatics, health informatics team. By the way, most of these people had never met each other, ever. And the fascinating thing that I discovered is right here, the research informatics team and the hospital informatics team, they all had the same degrees. Never met each other, never worked with each other. If you ask a hospital informatics team member what are data for, they are above all to protect. If you ask a research informatics team what are data for, they are to share, because only by sharing do we acquire new knowledge and learn. Hello, can I introduce you to your colleague? So these people were all like, whoa, okay, we've never really sat in a room like this. So I needed a program manager to ride herd on all of this. And luckily, the chief operating officer was intrigued enough with my idea that he bought me as part of an FTE of a project manager. So we started having biweekly meetings, and I laid out the scope of the program for this cerebral palsy program. I laid out all the benefits to the organization of doing this. I laid out the benefits for the patients, just as I have for you of doing this. And everything was going great until I got to this next bullet, which is, oh, and actually, you all have to change what you do when you go to work. The doctors were going to have to change their clinical practices. The nurses were going to have to change their clinical practices. The research and hospital informatics team were going to need to get to know each other and change the way that they interacted. And in fact, at this particular program, it had not been rolled out yet with electronic health records. So the EPIC team was involved, and they said, whoa, we've never done anything like this. You're putting researched data in our medical record? We've never done anything like this. So the entire mood of this cool experiment went from everybody being super excited about the wheel to super anxious about what I was going to tell them that they needed to do. This is like a lot of change. So suddenly people realized that we weren't doing an incremental step. Actually, I was one of those people that realized that. So it's time for more perspective. Change is hard because people overestimate the value of what they have, and they underestimate the value of what they might gain by giving that up. So this for sure was the tenor in the room. So then things got interesting because the other stakeholders that needed to be brought in were the head of the IRB. I don't know if you call it IRB here, Institutional Review Board for Human Protection, and the HIPAA, Health Insurance Act. So the head of legal services got involved, the chair of the IRB got involved, research administration. So when people discovered what I was doing, suddenly they were more, let's call it, interested in Bill's experiment. And I realized at one point that what seemed like such a simple systems engineering thing was actually pretty disruptive when I realized that I had the head of legal services and the chair of the IRB both nervous at the same time for two completely different reasons. This is all around what are data for, how can you, should you use them, what is the patient's role in the sharing of the data. By the way, to whom does patient data belong? The patient. Okay, we had to remind some people of that. And in our country, it's actually the law now. I don't know if it's the law here, but that's what HIPAA was all about. So this went from interesting to even more interesting when the only way that we could get them to resolve this is we created an IRB database protocol, an overarching IRB to be the gatekeeper of the data. And anybody that wanted to use patient level data to probe that data set had to go to the IRB and say exactly what they wanted to do, which is more normal in practice. But what I just want to highlight here, just to not leave it unspoken as you guys are on this journey as well, I just want to be clear for the doctors in the room. They made me get an IRB to put data in the EHR, which yesterday we called documentation. They did not trust what we were putting in the EHR. So it was fascinating to see how this was making people think differently. So the next step was we created routine clinical care data fields, which is the standard process. We were converting from paper to electronic. And then I approached the clinical care team, and I have this in blue because I've been asked by many people around the world, like, what was the secret sauce? And this gets closest to the secret sauce. I went to the clinical care team and I gave them several jobs to do. Commit to initial standard of care. And of course they said, well, for most of our stuff, we don't really have evidence-based standards. And I said, I don't care. If you don't have evidence-based standards, you guys are empowered to use your expert clinical judgment, but we cannot measure and prove that we've improved anything to all of the people that will not be thrilled with this project unless we show how much we changed it. And you cannot measure change unless you have a defined, objective starting point. So I realized that I had totally lost interest in what they started with. What I wanted was evidence where there was, expert opinion where there wasn't, but everybody in this trial was going to get the same care, documented in the same way each time. So the next thing that we did is that, of course, the doctors were not too thrilled about that. But I said, okay, what I realized is that you all are taking care of the patients. And what I needed was a way to get the doctors not to agree to do this, but to want to do it. Because already I had asked them to give up autonomy. And one of the things doctors love the most after going to all those years of medical school is that I know. People come to me, they want my opinion. I'm going to tell them what I think we should do. The problem is that everyone but one of them isn't doing the best. So doctors don't like it when you take away their autonomy. So what I came up with as a way to offer them is, you tell me, give me 3 to 5 questions that you have about your patients that you know that if I gave you the answer to those questions, you know it would improve the care of your own patients. And they looked at me, they said, no one's ever asked me that. I'm a clinician. I said, I'm asking because you participate in this trial and I'm going to bring you the data. And all I ask is that you analyze it and publish it, and you can improve your own patient's care. So I remind you, most of the people here are frontline clinicians, full-time clinical staff who spend their careers participating in what I would call today's care. They rarely get the opportunity to meaningfully participate in the generation of new knowledge, or what I call generating tomorrow's care. So when they realized that I was serious, they jumped at it. It took them 2 weeks to come up with their questions, but they came up with questions, not my questions, their questions, what they wanted to know, if I promised to give them the data so they could answer it. So based on that, we built these research data fields and research data elements to populate them so they could see that they were going to get the answers to their questions. And then we went back to the hospital EHR team and said, build this into the EHR. And they said, well, we've never done that. Like, I had to do this quickly before people figured out they didn't report to me. But they said, Bill said, put it in there. So we put it in there and we told the nurses when they come in for a billable patient encounter, fill out all the data. So we had to orient them around that. So the idea was clinical and research data fields got entered not into 2 databases, into a database that we call the electronic health record. And all of those documentation was done in the context of a billable patient encounter. And then those data were migrated to our data mark. So once we finally got this group in this one clinical program to do this, we got our first indication several months later that this might be powerful. So they went and presented an abstract at a CP meeting, and somebody walked up to them that had a multi-center NIH trial on CP, and they had been doing it for 3 years, and they came up to them and they said, "You just recruited more patients at your center in 1 year than I have with a multi-center trial in 3 years. How'd you do that?" And we realized, okay, this is the power of going from 3% of people being involved in research to 100. So back to our hypothesis, which is that we could cost effectively develop and implement a system that could drive quality improvement and reduce costs. So what the experiment that we actually did once we got everybody lined up was that we developed and implemented and evaluated a model of this EHR supported care in what turned out to be a cohort of 131 children with cerebral palsy. But it specifically integrated into every visit clinical care, QI, and research. And then for a very simple, basic outcome measure of could this change care, we looked at the changes in healthcare utilization rates and healthcare charges 12 months later and compared it to before you entered this program. So these are children. CP is a fixed disease. You're born with it, or you can develop it, but it is generally a fixed disease. It doesn't go away. It's lifelong. So in general, you have relatively stable healthcare needs with some episodes of things that can go wrong. So this was our experiment. So what we did is we divided this experiment into 2 groups, what we call the LFEP group, the Learn from Every Patient group, where we initialized or initiated the standardized care, expert opinion, plus evidence where it was there, routine clinical data collected in the HR that included those discrete data fields, which are the categories that drop down, and the discrete data elements, so that when they put it in, it actually was something that the computer could recognize easily. We did not need to use natural language processing. And what we did find is a dirty secret that a lot of people don't pay attention to, which is historically the medical record really had 2 main purposes. One is documentation for billing, and the other was documentation when the lawyers came around. And the reality is that the medical record throughout history has always been both incomplete and have errors. But you can see from the design of this experiment, we couldn't afford to do that. We found out later we had to change how we did documentation as well, because we might be using every single piece of data. So we had to hire somebody with content expertise in CP to check the data. Like, doctor, yeah, you can't have it involve this limb and this limb. This patient only has one disease. So they had to do quality control and help the doctors make sure the data were complete and correct. So then in the non-LFEP group, these patients, same institution, same disease, largely the same doctors, same year, they got our standard of care, which, as you now know, is not actually standardized, and they also got the standard care coordination. So this was a control group for the program activities of our LFEP program. So this is what the study design looks like. And it's important I spend a few minutes here. So here's our LFEP group, our 131 kids that we were going to study from an initial visit for a year. And we're going to compare them to their healthcare utilization and charges in the year before. And here is the non-LFEP group, which had almost 700 children. Here's the comparison period, and we compared them to their year before too. And what we realized is we needed a third group. We needed what we ended up calling a pre-LFEP group, because every medical center is always trying to improve care. There always are quality improvement projects going on. We needed to factor that out. And the way we factored it out is we went back to this exact same 131 children and looked at their healthcare utilization and their healthcare charges for the previous 12 months. So it should be improving. If the QI projects are working, healthcare utilization and charges should be going down. The question is, could we move the needle by implementing this program? So this was what we would call our time control, and this was our program activity control. So when we looked at the demographics, it turned out that our LFEP group was a couple of years younger than the non-LFEP group, and they actually had a little bit higher payment by our government, what we call Medicaid, than the non-LFEP group. But they were otherwise well matched. So these next few slides are the results of this pilot program, and I just want to tell you they're oriented in the exact same way. The LFEP group is in the left on black. The pre-LFEP time control group is in the middle, and the non-LFEP program activity group is on the right. So when we looked at what happened when you put these people in this program for 12 months, we looked at change in inpatient admission. So the LFEP group had a 27% reduction in admissions compared to 9% the year before, and compared to 4% in the same patients at the same hospital with the same doctors with the same diagnosis. So when we looked at change in total inpatient days, 43% decrease compared to 34 the year before, and compared to 38 in the patients that were not in this program. This was actually statistically significantly different. For changes in ER visits, a 30% reduction in ER visits compared to 8% the year before, and a 2% increase in the non-LFEP, and an almost 30% change in urgent care visits compared to 6% increase in the year before. Identical patients. So these are utilization rates of healthcare. Now we're going to convert it to charges. And it's Chad. I have Chad's slide right here. Here are your dollars. So when we looked at these exact same groups for that experimental group, the changes in inpatient charges per child were a little over $10,000 in 12 months compared to a $5,000 improvement the year before. So we basically doubled the reduction in healthcare charges in those identical patients. And it also doubled it compared to patients in the same year with the same diagnosis cared for at the same medical center. Similar changes were seen in healthcare charges in the emergency room. These are just much smaller dollars, but the LFEP group outperformed the other groups there, and also for urgent care charges. And when we looked at all three of those together, what we call total unscheduled care charges, still the LFEP group had a $10,000 per person in 1 year in one clinical program reduction compared to either of the other groups. Literally twice as good. And when we looked at total health system charges for those patients, it turned out that it tripled the reduction in health system charges compared to either the time control group or the program activity group. So, all right, so this is Chad's with dollars. That's a CFO slide. Now, if you're the chief medical officer, do we have a CMO? Okay, well, tell her I had a slide for her. Okay, so here are those exact same data looking at percent improvements in healthcare charges. So 34% reduction in charges per child compared to 15% the year before. 23% reduction in ER charges compared to increases in both of the other groups, the time control and the program control group. 29%, 28% reduction in urgent care charges. And if you summed all of those together, here are the unscheduled, 34% reduction in unscheduled care charges for children with presumably a fixed lesion, compared to 13 to 18%. And again, total system charges down by 25% compared to 7% and 9%. So again, those are the exact same data, just parsed in two different ways. So just to summarize, what we found was a 43% reduction in total inpatient days, 27% reduction in admissions, 30% reduction in ER visits, 29% reduction in urgent care visits, 34% reduction in total charges. So for this particular program, that was about $1.25 million, and total unscheduled about almost $1.4 million. Reduced in one program in 1 year. Oh, and did I mention they got better care? So this program has received an unbelievable amount of scrutiny. So it got rejected from, I think, 7 journals by statisticians almost always. And one of the questions was, well, everybody's always improved. Show us about what is your incremental improvement. So this is a slide that we've created to address the incremental improvement in healthcare charges. So compared to the time control group, there was a 210% reduction in healthcare charges. Compared to the program activities control group, 176% reduction in charges. And there were similar but lesser reductions compared to unscheduled care charges. Those are incremental on top of what was already the improvements that were already being made with existing programs. So back to the model that seems so simple. So a whole other group of people have gotten interested in this project and scrutinized it. And there are several deans of medical schools that have said, how'd you do that? And then they said, okay, well, that's great, but this, you didn't really, you only went halfway around your own circle. So one of them looked at me and said, where's the learning? Like, okay, well, let's talk about the learning. So what we published was what happened when we implemented the program. What we showed is the system benefits from doing that. Now let's talk about the benefits for the doctors and the patients. So this slide is a little bit busy. I don't want to get lost in the details, but remember, I challenge those doctors. You give me your questions you want the answers to. Those questions are over here on the left. This center column shows the research progress to date. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Manuscript published, manuscript in preparation, published. So I gave them the data to improve their own patients' care. They loved it. They loved it. Nobody had ever given them the chance to improve care. They were getting paid to provide care. And here is the most important part. This is the completion of the circle, the implementation. And I just want to highlight these 2 things. So direct impact on patient care. So that project about hip films already altered the practice pattern, already been implemented, and every child that comes to our hospital now no longer gets annual hip films. And we didn't have to read somebody else's article about it. We generated all those data in our own program. Our doctors who wanted the answer to that question published it, which we can show to the families and we could show to payers, and improved care and reduced radiation exposure to our patients, all at the same time in 1 year. So this is the power of integrating research, not adding research onto clinical care. This is integrating research into the provision of clinical care systematically collect the data, systematically analyze the data, systematically validate the data. So from this little experiment, we drew several conclusions. The first was that a learning health system could actually be developed and implemented in a cost-effective manner. I got a lot of scrutiny around how much that cost you. So I had to estimate, because I had partial FTEs of people who I had borrowed before they found out they didn't report to me. But we estimated that it was about $225,000 used. And if you look at the ROI, the return on investment for that investment was only 16% of the money our health system saved in 1 year. The other way to look at that, for every dollar that our organization put toward this program, in 1 year, they got $6 back. That's pretty good investment where I come from. Another conclusion was that such programs can, in fact, systematically drive simultaneous clinical quality improvement and reduce costs at the same time. And I'm not sure if you all have models of accountable care organizations, but this is a model that is particularly suited to the ACO model, where a health system gets paid a fixed amount, whether a patient uses medical care or not, whether they go to the ER or the ICU or not. But this system absolutely plays it. I had several people ask me why my CFO didn't fire me for losing him $1.3 million in the experiment, which I thought was amusing. Okay, so I want to share my learnings here with you, since you all are on this journey as well. One of them is that broad-based buy-in is essential if you want a program like this to succeed. Not just the clinicians, not just the researchers, the people that manage the money, and politically too. So remember that stakeholder slide. There are many people, even if they are not directly involved in a project like this, you need them to at least sign off on it and agree not to stop it, get in the way, hinder it, right? So like we had to figure out how to get past our legal team and our IRB team, and we came up with a workable solution, which is we'd have an IRB for our EHR. I'm like, okay, fine. But we had to deal with all of those stakeholders, or we would have never been able to do this experiment. Another major learning here, perhaps the most important, is that this integration of research and clinical care requires significant culture change. The doctors had to give up one of the things that doctors love. Doctors love writing a paragraph about our patient. This is a 6-year-old child with a 3-day history of this and this. There was none of that. It was all drop-down menus. So they kind of got gypped for the fun, the art of medicine and doing that. What I gave them, however, was something that they valued more. I gave them data to improve the care of that 6-year-old child. But all of these different people had to change the way that they did their work. This is what I mean by aligning those interests. So what I think we have learned is that culture change is really the largest barrier to realizing the benefits of a learning health system. I would say this was true when we did this experiment. It's even more true now. The technical challenges to do this have really, they are either already addressable, or at some medical centers, they have already been addressed. This is no longer, I would consider, a legitimate barrier to the creation of a learning health system. If you can get the IT people to work together, you can generate this, you can integrate these data sets. So just pulling this all together, I'm a very firm believer now that there are huge opportunities for those medical centers that are willing and able to change. Let me just list a few. Systematic improvement in clinical care, check. Reductions in healthcare expenditures, check. An expected market advantage if you can advertise a robust delivery of evidence-based care. Very few medical centers can actually legitimately guarantee that if you bring your child to our medical center, you will get evidence-based care. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Unprecedented opportunity to phenotype biological samples. There are lots and lots of people now generating biological samples, omics. There's omics data, terabytes of data all over the place. The value from omics data, I actually do some omics research, is in how well phenotyped the patient was at the time the sample was collected. This provides outstanding opportunities to more carefully phenotype the patients from which those samples and data were collected. It also offers a tremendous opportunity for the incorporation of patient-reported outcomes. So in the US, the FDA is very big on patient-reported outcomes. In fact, you can get drugs approved based on PROs, patient-reported outcomes. So this also plays into that, but PROs could be a data set that gets incorporated into this model. This also provides the opportunity for career advancement for academic faculty. I think I've already made the point. The people that did this were almost full-time clinicians. They were so excited that they had the chance to get publications. They don't have to be first author. They just need to have publications to get promoted on the clinical track. What they loved was they had the opportunity to improve care, not just deliver care. And that actually really resonated with them and the reason that they went into medicine. And then finally, as I mentioned, this LFEP model dovetails very well with the ACO model. So what might the future look like for this? So is this program scalable? Can it be successfully applied to adult care? Could it be applied to surgical care? Could it be transferable to other institutions, as in that model that I showed you with the bottom-up approach? Is it transferable to other countries? So I'm sorry to tell you, but every single one of those was attached to rejection letters. So people literally said, you can't have done this. We don't believe your data. There was no randomized controlled prospective trial, so I don't believe anything that you have reported. It's not scalable, therefore not valuable. I take a more optimistic approach to this. The approach that I take is these are actually testable questions. We've already proven that you can do this and test it. So we are very interested in trying to answer questions like that. And part of what drew me here when Roland told me about her new job was, wow, you have a whole health system that's interested in doing this. Let me share with you what I did. So I will share with you that my own institution did not pick this up and scale it up. There were people in our C-suite that were like, yeah, I'm not really sure I understand how that worked, and it didn't get picked up. Where it did get picked up is the Veterans Health Administration that has 6 million veterans in our country. They were very interested in it. CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, had me give national grand rounds as a model for how to do learning health systems. And several other countries that have integrated electronic health records have expressed interest in this. So this is doable, but it is a lot of change. And what I'd like to leave you with is one final thought as you move down this path. Progress is impossible without change, and those who can't change their minds can't change anything. So I have met a lot of people along this journey who literally could not change their minds. And I'm here because I'm committed to the idea that there are people out there, maybe like you, that are interested and willing to make changes to try to come up with a way to systematically improve care. So let me just give acknowledgments to the numerous people that were actually on the core team that put this program together and helped and analyze it. And this is Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, where I work. So with that, I think I will close, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Don't worry if you'd like to trash what I presented. I've heard worse.
That was great. Questions? Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah. So not built into this program. So we have infrastructure to support people that are interested in doing that. So you can get biostats support just as a faculty member at our institution. However, for some of these initial data sets, so some of the people that helped build it and helped build the data mart, once they saw what it was, they actually were really interested. So I think they got some help from them just because they caught the interest of this being a different type of data set. It's not just clinical data in the EHR, but not directly as part of the program.
O'Neill.
About how anecdotes can shift or not shift the behavior of organizations. When I wait to prove the concept, it could enhance the self-efficacy of an organization to say we can actually do this. Or they can say it's one-off, it's just, and I'm curious if involves controlling organizations that want to run with this in their own organization that you have a mixed response. Talk a little bit about
Even though they hired me to do it. Yes.
the power of the anecdote and the limitation.
So there's a saying that I learned several years ago. If you are trying to influence a large organization, and I think that it is true, and that is one example is worth 1,000 theories. Because what it does is it changes the conversation from the 8 people who could say why it won't work or why it's not well designed, why it doesn't have a control group. But if you say, well, actually, we have done that here, then the question becomes whether the level of interest in doing it, not is it possible? And it changes the entire flavor of the conversation. So in my particular case, not enough to get them to do it, but it is literally a proof of concept. So I was telling Roland before, so some very, very high-powered journals were super interested in this. And their statisticians said, this is not how we do research. Like we had 2 control groups, but we didn't have a randomized control group. I'm like, well, let us invite you to the hospital where we don't randomize humans. We actually provide care for them. But it got killed because nobody actually considered what is practical to actually do in the provision of care. And I remind you, this is a very large industry, right? This is in my country, almost 20% of our gross domestic product goes to that. But the people that are holding us back are people that want us to randomize them. Like, you should be looking for new ideas. So I will share with you, so the VA, which is a government institution in the US, so I was shocked, but when I got invited to Washington to present to their senior leadership, they were the most astute, forward-looking health system leaders I met in the entire US. The woman actually stopped me in the middle of the presentation. She said, I get it, I love it, like, we want to hire you. And so they couldn't figure out how to hire me because the VA is for veterans, and I couldn't provide care for a veteran because I could only do children. So they actually abandoned it because they literally could not hire me to do this in their system. They had a way to scale it up. They didn't have control of the content. So they were very interesting. And then the other most interesting one is probably one of the best organizations in the US at implementation science, not clinical research, but implementation science, had me come to California, Kaiser Permanente. And they were very interested in this because they know how to do it all the time. They're not experts in the science of what we're going to do, but in implementing. It was very interesting. I found myself in a room and I thought these were all doctors like me. They were all implementation scientists. So it was very interesting, but they also were interested in bringing somebody with content expertise into their system, because they actually started a whole medical school to better teach doctors to get used to making changes in clinical care and implementation science, because they couldn't find them in the marketplace. So there were some very interesting interactions. Israel was very interested. They have everybody in Israel on an integrated health system. Belgium was interested. Singapore has 3 medical systems, all integrated. So there's a lot of interest in the concept, but implementation is really the hard part. So I appreciate your question.
We've got Geeta and then Joyce and then Owen.
Usually compared models, they were academic comparing the care provision versus UI or research. And we work typically in parallel streams rather than the learning from every basic model that we take under review. How does an organization bypass some of these? Policies that hospitals have to connect their data. Also, affects our ability to actually.
Yeah. So to be clear, they're not to be gone around. They have important roles in the organization, but historically those work streams and those approvals and the process and all that sort of stuff, they were not connected. That's not that they can't be connected, they just haven't been connected. But in my particular case, for my example, we found something that was acceptable to them, and they didn't even blink when I pointed out to them. So it's a new rule at our hospital now that we need to have an IRB approval to put information in the EHR. And I pointed that irony out to them. And they're like, yeah, just submit your IRB. So we submitted the IRB, and it kind of was this umbrella. And then anybody who wanted to access that data mart had to do a regular submission like we all do where the IRB does its more traditional role. But they were very nervous around how those data might be used. So this is why I say this is really more about culture change for the organization. Like, could those informed consents and could those workflows be connected? Yes. Yes, they could. There are medical centers now with opt-out. You come in the door, and unless you sign an opt-out, they are able to use your blood samples and your data for limited extent. So there are ways to solve the problem. But my assessment is this is really a self-reflective challenge. It's not that these things couldn't be done that way. But it's a lot of change. And first you have to convince people that the change is worth it.
We have 1 minute left. Joe said you can make super short and tight.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what conscious or cultural changes are needed in during.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point, and I didn't really get into that. So the patients did have to get an informed consent, and 90-something% of the people approached with this experiment, Bill's experiment, signed up for it. I think one of the ones that did not was non-English speaking, and we didn't have a Spanish form, but it was among the many barbs that I've gotten on this over the years. One of them was that Bill might scare people away by thinking that they're guinea pigs. And so the reality is, when people, if you truly inform them, if they understand that if you come here, you will get the best evidence that we have, which we can't say now. You will get the best evidence that we have now. And in exchange, all we ask is that you allow us to use the information that we collect in giving you that evidence-based care to help the child behind you. Most people, parents and children, are very receptive to that. So one of those workflows was actually a patient survey among parents of kids with CP on what they would rather see, what they wanted to see improved in their care flow. So they did get involved, but it was through a survey mechanism. But as I pointed out at the end, the patient reported outcomes. So that's the way to incorporate questionnaires and things like that. But that is definitely, it's able to be plugged into this model as well. Just isn't done routinely.
Ask Elaine just a really short question, hopefully, because you're already a little bit late.
Sorry.
My question is around how you incorporate the patient perspective and where feedback, which could be some sort of the second piece of it. Talk about the cultural barriers. And what are some of the work that has gone on the way to address some of those barriers? It's not one of them.
Yeah, so I could just tell you that that's very much a work in process. So where I did it, they were not willing to make those cultural changes at that time. So what I have done is sharpened our focus on what the cultural changes that would be required are. I've not personally seen a health system that has successfully done it at scale.